This is the DLM Forum 2015 presentation on the metadata exchange profile between a record system and an archive.
In eArc, we have this group that specializes on the export of records, and that means content and metadata from a record system to an archive. And our primary question is, what information needs to be extracted from the record system and passed on to the archive so that the archive can do its job. And the job the archive needs to do is defined by ORS. It needs to ingest content and metadata, it needs to store it, it needs to perform data management, it needs to perform administrative tasks, it needs to ensure preservation, and there's a whole lot in there. It needs to have technical metadata so that we can use electronic documents. It needs to ensure authenticity, viability, integrity of the system, so there's a whole lot of information that's needed in order to ensure that. And it needs to support access. So what we want to do is we want to have a dedicated records systems SIP profile that can be adopted by organizations across Europe. So we're proposing a standard profile. And once we have developed this metadata profile, then we can build tools that are based on it. So we can build tools that extract data in the native format from the record system. We can build tools that create the standard zip package from this extracted metadata by translating it into the standard. We can build tools that validate that the package meets the specification, that it's complete, that it is consistent, and so on, and we can export it. To put it in the context of Karin's and Tara's presentation again, you can imagine that we're building an onion where the outer layer is the common specification here, then inside it is a more specific one, the general specification, then inside it is the content type specific one, which is for record systems. And as we go from the less specific to the more specific, what we do is we inherit entities and metadata elements from the outer layer, but we also add entities and metadata elements to it. And Karin and Tara have already said we need to enable that. So when we specify our standard, we need to define extension points where you can take a foreign schema and plug it in so you can add specific information that's needed on the more specific domain. Or like in Morec, we have the contextual metadata elements, and they let you define additional individual metadata elements on a meta level. So we can either use extension points for foreign schemas, or we can add additional metadata elements. And then we can override things that we've inherited from the outside, so we can have more specific cardinality, we can have more granular data types, for example, than were defined on the outside. We can add controlled vocabularies that are specific to our domain. And when we're done collecting all the values for our metadata, then we pack them up into one information package and export it. And when we're defining those different layers that you've heard about in these three presentations, we try to reuse principles so that they're as consistent as possible. You can then become more specific and add business-specific layers, for example, social security information or local implementation information that is dictated by regulations that apply locally. And again, we are not doing that in eArc, but we're allowing for it to happen by using extension points. So if you look at our scenario, we have an archival transfer between two repositories. So there's a records management system and there's an archive. These are repositories, and information is exchanged using exchange formats. So the SIP is a metadata specification that we provide for you, and then various record systems can share this definition and send to various archives. So it's an exchange format. From the perspective of the archive, the record system is the producer. It is an agent. And then when we want to access it, the DIP is the exchange format that goes out to the consumer. when we deposit things in the archive, we have to choose the right sort of representation that we want to use. One possibility is that we extract the information from the record systems basically in its native format. If it's already a database, we can treat it as database preservation, and this is what Jan will discuss after the lunch break. In this case, though, the metadata that describes the records in the record system is sort of hidden inside this database. And so what we can do with it is we can have a multi-record zip that we make available to our producers, and then the original producer, the record system, can, for example, go back and reuse this information for business purposes or for re-ingest even. The archivist can access it, for example, to check that metadata is correct or corrected if it isn't, to perform preservation actions, to do administrative tasks. And the access at this point has to happen in two possible ways. Either we have database queries using a database language, if we know what the entity relationship model of this representation is, or we can actually license and preserve the original records management system here, export it and rerun it on the original system. So there's some barriers to use here. And the alternative is that we have a semantic representation where we semantically mark up the content that came from the record system. So we extract the native information, and every record one at a time that adds the metadata that describes the records that we're exporting. And we are agreeing on a standard format that we're storing inside the archive, and that lets us then perform cross-archival search on individual records, for example. So this path here says you deposit a set of marked up records to us, and we can make the same set available to you as before. But what we can do now is, because they're semantically marked up, we can take records that come from different record systems and we can merge them into one unified view, and we can search across the records from all different sorts of record systems, so we can enable other consumers to also access that information. So they might do independent research on the content, they might perform legal studies. And so having these semantic representations has the advantage that we can uniformly manage the records and the metadata, that we can merge information from different systems, that we don't need to have use complex database queries or license record software. But the disadvantage is that there was a lot of functionality performed by the record system. So for example, MORAC has a long list of requirements of what a record should perform. For example, a record system must permit you to list all events that happen to a record in chronological order. So if we don't use the original records software anymore, then we have to decide what functionality is supported by the archive when we're accessing it. So this is sort of the playing field in which we're acting. And in my talk, when I'm not focusing on the access side, this will be something that you might hear about at the next DLM forum. I'm also not talking about the databases. Jan will do that. My presentation will be on the semantic representations and the XML markup. We have two use cases. One is we're taking records that come from record systems and that can be presumed to have the metadata that you'd expect to find in a standard record system. So ideally they would be more compliant, but not necessarily. So we're relaxing this a little bit. We're also dealing with simple file system-based files, and that's simply a demand that the stakeholders that are involved in the EARC project have. They receive either files or folders from file systems or from data content management systems such as SharePoint, and these files don't have all the metadata that you would expect or need in order to manage it in an archive, or that you would come from a record system already. So what EARC needs to do is we need to develop additional tools that let you enter manually the missing descriptive metadata, and then Otherwise, we try to have as uniform as possible an information package definition for both of them. The rest of my talk is about what does this exactly look like, this metadata definition that we're doing. We're basing it on MOROC 2000 and we're extending it through other standards. Goals and methodology. We have 2 records producers and 6 national archives participating in this task, and they're the ones that define the requirements that we have. We have 3 systems companies that implement the specifications and the tools that we're specifying and validate that they're useful and do the job in our stakeholder organizations that we want them to do. So the first step is to perform the analysis that Tarva has talked about. We have taken Tarva's use cases, workflows, and functional requirements and amended them for the specific case of record systems. So I think these are already useful tools that you can use when you have a similar task, because you can see what specifications we've done for that. Then the second step is to do the actual metadata definition, and since this is the focus of my presentation, I will discuss this in more detail in just a second. And then the third step is to develop the tools. So there's one path of tools that can be developed without knowing the metadata. That would be tools, for example, that let you select the records in the record system that you want to export, or tools that support the export. But then the tools here that depend on our metadata definition, and those tools are things like the tools that extract the metadata in the native implementation. Will validate that on the Alfresco system. And then there are tools that implement the SIP creation and the validation to make sure that the SIP itself complies with the specification and is valid and useful. Then the next step is that we run pilot projects in which we evaluate the specifications and the tools. We feed back to these stages until we're happy with the state that we want to achieve. Then we can develop best practice guidelines and lessons learned and feed back our experience into the MOROC effort. So let me get back to this main stage of my presentation, which is the metadata definition. As you know, there's an existing MOROC export service and an XSD, so an XML schema definition that goes with it. And it describes the export from a MOROC-compliant record system to another MOROC-compliant record system, assuming that you preserve a lot of the functionalities from the original system. Now, our scenario looks similar, but it's not exactly the same thing. We're exporting from what might not be a MOROC compliant record system, so we have a partial export, and we're exporting to an archive. So the purpose of the repository that receives is slightly different, and that means that we can use MOROC really only as a source of inspiration. We want to reuse as much as possible, and we need to analyze what the gaps are. And the gaps are displayed here. So if MOROC is the black circle and the EARC SIP is the red circle, then in the middle you have all the things that we're simply adopting from MOROC. But there are some things that we won't adopt, and there are 2 reasons. One reason is either because our participating partner site simply cannot provide the information. For example, the MOROC XST has a lot of mandatory elements that our partner sites simply can't produce or hold. So we need to relax MOROC in that sense a little bit. The other reason why we might not adopt them is that MOROC allows you to specify services that are important in a record system, but that are no longer important in an archive because it's not an actively managed set of records anymore, so we don't need to export those. But we also need to add functionality that's simply not needed in a record system, and that metadata would describe things like the export itself, mapping from different classification hierarchies to each other if we have different sources of information. There needs to be metadata that ensures the digital preservation itself. And then maybe additional metadata if the archive simply chooses to have additional functionality. So I said an archive can choose to merge records from different sources. So if we want to do that, we need to do certain mappings that need to be supported through metadata. So this is why our eArc-ERMS XST isn't simply the same thing as the MOREC XST. So I need to emphasize this is work in progress. A lot of the things that I present are under discussion at the moment. We are in the phase where we're defining the data model, and that means we need to decide which entities are we adopting. So are we, for the archive, are we describing records, aggregations, events, and so on? And if we describe events, for which entities do we describe them? And we need to define which relationships between these entities we want to support. So for example, if we have an aggregation, what is a parent aggregation for it? These sorts of relationships. So let me show you an example for descriptive metadata. You're familiar with the black boxes from MOREC. So there's a record with its components, with its class, aggregation, disposal schedule, and so on. The black boxes are entities that we're supporting in eArc. Those are things that we need to know in the archive, so we're exporting those. And then I said we have things that we need in addition. So for example here, a special type of component is an electronic component. And for electronic components, MOREC only lets you specify 2 extra fields, which is the presentation order and John, you would know. I can't remember. There's another field. But it doesn't let us define all the things that we need for preservation purposes. So for preservation purposes, we need to describe the computer files themselves in quite some detail, and we need to define representations in the premise sense of the word. So in premise, we have a concept where we say a representation is a set of files that together make up one document. So I might have digitized a 10-page document and have 10 TIFF images that together need to be managed as one unit. And for preservation purposes, we need to have technical information, we need to have provenance information, we need to have rights information that describe things on the level of a computer file or a representation. So we want to find a way of combining the preservation metadata with the descriptive metadata that comes from MOREC. Another example is for an aggregation. Our stakeholders have said they'd like to be able to specify what framework they're adopting. So they'd like to specify that they're using ISAT, for example. They might want to have multi-language support, things like this. So the extension points where we can say we can add to the MOREC model. A second example would be administrative metadata. So MOREC says every entity has information about events, about access control that includes users and groups and so on. And so we need to ask ourselves what of that information is needed in an archive. So obviously we want to have event information on the record. We probably want it for every class and for an aggregation, but it's not necessarily clear whether we need event information for a disposal schedule once it's archived, because at the point of archiving, we're taking a snapshot of the thing in time, how it is valid at that point. So we need to discuss, do we want to have a complete repertoire of event and access control information on these levels? This is the sort of questions we're still answering at the moment. Another interesting question here is related to the database discussions you'll have this afternoon. So in MOREC, there is a group and a user entity, and the group is actually there for convenience. A group groups users together, and users inherit from the group. So if we attach role information to a group, for example, then the user in the group inherits the access control permissions for this role from the group. And there's a conflict in the archival situation. So in an archive, we'd like to have the data model as simple as possible. We want to have as few elements as possible, because if we need to remember in the archive that a user inherits from a group, this is a sort of functionality and implicit knowledge that needs to be remembered for sure. So in 20 or 50 years' time, we still remember that this sort of information can be gotten from a group. So in a data warehousing scenario, we would denormalize that and we'd say we're not supporting groups anymore, we're just supporting users. But the trade-off is that we have to duplicate information. So that's a class of questions that we're tossing around at the moment. How much of implicit inheritance that's available and defined in MOREC should be available in the archive or should be made explicit so it is less of a preservation risk? No answer there yet, but we're discussing that. Other entities that we don't need in the archive is the entity type definition, for example, system metadata element definitions. Those are simply not needed because the same information is already included in the EARC-ZIP definition, so we don't need to repeat that information. And then I said we have this part that is in addition to MOREC that's not covered by MOREC simply because MOREC exports to a MOREC record system and not to an archive. And so some of the information that we need to add is systems metadata information about all the systems that were involved in creating metadata or records for preservation purposes, and so that we can reuse them on a technical level. We need a lot of rights information. We need local controlled vocabularies because we need to match local controlled vocabularies to the controlled vocabularies that are used in the archive. And the submission agreement is a particularly interesting thing. As Tara said, I think it came out of PIMAS. And the idea is that a specific record system makes a contract with the archive about a lot of the detail that they need to know about each other so they can successfully exchange information. And that can either be in unstructured general documents, or we could theoretically even take this information and create or adopt structured metadata for it so it can automatically be interpreted and used by our tools. So examples of information that would go into a submission agreement is information about agents and system information, about the ZIP creation, about local customized metadata profiles that the record system has created, about documentation on how to use the content. Simply if I, for example, have a complex database, then I need to have information about how to query it and how to interpret the results. I need information on controlled vocabularies, keys, data types, character encodings, and so on. I need information that can link the local records descriptions to those used in the archive if the original record system and the archive use different classification hierarchies, for example. Or I need to specify configuration options. So one question that we discussed is, does the archive need to know each user that had access control rights, or is it okay to just have role information about which role had access control rights in the record system? And the answer that stakeholders gave, it depends on the use case. So if I have a legal situation where I need to prove who had access and modified a record, then I need to actually know user-based information. If somebody deposits records of archival value, there's no reason we should have to know which administrator in a record system did what to the record. So we have a configuration option. Another configuration option would be use of alternative local names, whether the archive should archive residual records and such pieces of information, and that information then could in theory be automatically used in order to configure our EARC ZIP creation tools or extraction tools or validation tools. And another thing I wanted to notice, we were puzzling a little bit about, on the left-hand side here you have the record system world, and on the right-hand side you have metadata that we need to add once we're ingesting it into the archive. And we see that there's a lot of things that look similar, and we need to decide how are we treating those things that look similar. So an example would be events. In the record system, the MOREC system has recorded the events that happen to a record, for example, and that becomes a contextual important metadata that needs to be preserved in the archive. And we can use MOREC in order to to represent that information. Now, once it's in the archive will perform its own events on keeping those records alive and accessible. So one question is, for example, should they be linked? So a choice could be this is implemented in MOREC and this is implemented in Premise, and they're not linked because they're describing two different domains. But another choice would be to say we take the MOREC information and we duplicate it in Premise so that we have one combined view over the whole life cycle of the record, no matter where it was. So those are a few questions that we're answering at the moment. Then if we look at access control metadata, there's the one that applied while it was in the record system. In the archive, we have also access control, but it's completely different because this is dictated by archival policy and applies to what happens in the archive. There's absolutely no reason we should think about whether they should be linked or because this is contextual metadata and this is system maintenance metadata at this point. Very interesting for us was to discuss descriptive metadata. So it turns out that of our 6 participating archives, everybody uses descriptive metadata in a different way, and that came out yesterday already a little bit in this discussion of the connection between MOREC and ISAT. If we have different record systems depositing with the archive, they use different classification hierarchies and different aggregation hierarchies. So some of our archives are obliged by law to maintain their classification hierarchies and preserve the information as is with the descriptive metadata from the record system. We have one archive that participates that has basically a master classification hierarchy, and when you deposit with that archive, the descriptive metadata from the original record system gets mapped to the master classification hierarchy in the archive, and then in the archive all the access and management happens on this layer. So what we need is we need to enable metadata that can link the old representations to the new representations. And then we need to link both of them to the technical provenance and rights information that we need for preservation purposes. So this is sort of interesting that there are these 3 completely different relationships in these instances. Disposal schedules also would be the same example here, where we have similar things treated very differently. So for all of this, we need to define what metadata elements do we need. So for example, if I have a record, I need identifiers, I need descriptions, I might need date times and so on. So we're going down to the detail, we're making lists, and we're creating those lists from, first of all, from the metadata that Karen and Tarva have explained to you earlier, so to make sure that it all fits together seamlessly. Then we have we have copied all the MOREC lists, and all of our stakeholders go through it element at a time, saying whether they would need that information in an archive or not. We have added tables where every one of our stakeholders says, in addition to MOREC, we have these additional metadata elements, and we think that they are mandatory or nice to have, and so on. And then we've gone through all the lists of requirements, because often the requirements mention metadata needs that aren't actually explicitly expressed somewhere else. And so we've extracted all the metadata that's mentioned in the requirements and the use cases to see that that's actually contained in our data model. So we're at the moment working through all these tables and have lots of, oops, I'm doing it again. So we're going through with discussions and lists of comments and coming to an agreement of what we should adopt in eArc and what is lacking in MOREC and how we should adopt it. So what I've described to you at this point was coming up with a data model. That's the logical step, where we're simply describing what information is needed. We haven't thought about much yet. What standard do we use, or how do we implement it? But once we're done and satisfied with what is the information that we need, then we need to say how are we going to implement it. And so we have a lot of standards choices. There's a sizable number of standards that are relevant for our domain. and we need to make the right choice of which one to use for what sort of information. So if we look at standards, they have the following properties. There's no single standard that can simply be adopted, because no single standard has all the information that we want. So for example, Premise has preservation metadata but doesn't describe descriptive metadata. MORAC has descriptive metadata but no preservation metadata. The second point is, for pretty much anything we would like to encode, we have several options to choose from. So for example, if I want to record an event, I could do that using MORAC, or I could do that using Premise. So I have to decide which one is the better for the particular function that I want to support in the archive. If I want to describe the location of a computer file, I can do that either in METS, in the file sec, or I can do it in Premise, or I can do it in MORAC. So I have lots of choices, and I need to decide how do I combine them best, and what are the functions that I really want to use so I can use them to their fullest strength. And in eArc, we cannot implement every possible standard that might possibly be applicable. We need to make some choices for our reference model and then support that. And if there should be available time, then one could do translations from one standard to another possibly, but we have to make a choice simply. And one way of going about it is that we're creating metadata categories. So I've shown you this example already. This is descriptive metadata with records and classes and so on. So we're calling this a category descriptive metadata. And for all the other metadata that we've identified, we've created the categories. And then that makes it a little bit easier. Those are all things that are managed together. So access control information is managed together. Ways of extending our zip profile through your local customizations is managed together. Descriptive metadata, preservation metadata, submission agreement metadata. So once we've narrowed it down by not looking at individual entities but at categories anymore, then we can say, well, this is a possible candidate. We could use premise rights here. We could use unstructured information here. We could use an eArc extension, for example, here, and we could use MORAC here, and so on. So again, this is work in progress. And what I also wanted to say is there's no, as I've hinted at, there's no need that we need to have the same standards in the deposited metadata that we get from the record system and the one that is added once it's inside the archive. So once we've defined our standard choices, we have to buckle down to the nitty-gritty detail. So we have to decide what representation language we do, and we've already agreed we use XML because this is what we want to use throughout our records management work in eArc. We need to decide details like data types, cardinality. We also want to discuss optimization. And optimization simply could be if I have values or controlled vocabularies that are shared by a lot of different records. We don't want to duplicate that information inside every record, even though strictly speaking it belongs inside every record. We need to judge well where we can link to external information that's held inside the archive. So this is about optimization. And then finally, once we've done all that, then we can come up with validation rules that the validation tools can use so that they can decide that the files are all there, that the classes that are mentioned are actually contained in the class hierarchies, that the data types fit our profile, and so on. So what I have shown you is our approach to answering the question what metadata is. Needs to be exported from a record system to an archive so that we can successfully archive.